The Desert Fox Hunter, David Stirling. He parachuted behind enemy lines with a broken back. He created a military unit that shouldn't have existed, using tactics that shouldn't have worked. With fewer than 100 men, he destroyed more enemy aircraft than the entire Royal Air Force in North Africa. The Germans were so terrified of him, they issued standing orders: if captured, execute immediately. This is the story of the man who invented modern special operations warfare, the aristocrat who became a commando and changed military history forever. Stay until the end to discover how his greatest success led to his most devastating failure. David Stirling was born on November 15, 1915, at his family's ancestral estate, Keir House in Perthshire, Scotland. He entered a world of wealth, privilege, and aristocratic tradition. His father, Brigadier General Archibald Stirling, was a decorated military officer and wealthy landowner. His mother, Margaret Fraser, came from one of Scotland's most distinguished families. David was the youngest of 6 children, growing up in castles and manor houses, educated by private tutors, destined for a life of comfortable privilege. The Stirling family traced its lineage back centuries, with ancestors who had fought in every major British military conflict. The family motto was "Gang forward, go forward, never retreat." This martial tradition shaped David from childhood. He was expected to serve, to lead, to bring honor to the family name. But young David Stirling seemed an unlikely warrior. As a child, David was restless and rebellious. He hated the rigid structure of aristocratic life. Formal dinners bored him. Traditional education frustrated him. He wanted adventure, excitement, challenges that tested him physically rather than academically. His teachers described him as intelligent but lazy, capable of excellence but unmotivated by conventional schooling. He preferred climbing mountains, sailing, and testing himself against nature. David attended Ampleforth College, a prestigious Catholic boarding school, where he continued to resist authority and conventional expectations. He was athletic and adventurous, but academically mediocre. He spent his time organizing elaborate pranks and planning mountain climbing expeditions rather than studying. His family despaired of him ever settling into a respectable career. After leaving Ampleforth, David briefly studied at Cambridge University, but dropped out after less than a year. University life bored him as much as boarding school had. He wanted real challenges, not academic ones. In the mid-1930s, David set his sights on climbing Mount Everest. Everest had been climbed only rarely, and David believed mountaineering would give his life the purpose and excitement it lacked. David spent several years training for Everest, becoming an accomplished mountaineer. He climbed in the Scottish Highlands, the Alps, and other challenging locations, developing exceptional physical conditioning and mental toughness. But his Everest expedition was canceled due to political tensions in the region. Disappointed but undeterred, David began looking for other challenges. Then came September 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and Britain declared war. David Stirling, like millions of young British men, felt the call to serve. But he didn't want a conventional military role. He joined the Scots Guards, one of Britain's elite infantry regiments, but quickly found peacetime military training as boring as university had been. He wanted action, not parade drill. In 1940, David volunteered for a new unit called No. 8 Commando, later renamed Lay Force after its commander, Colonel Robert Laycock. The commandos were an experimental force, small units of highly trained soldiers who would conduct raids against enemy positions. It was exactly what David had been looking for: unconventional warfare that rewarded initiative and daring rather than strict adherence to regulations. David deployed to North Africa with Lay Force in 1941. The North African campaign was unlike warfare in Europe. Vast desert expanses, extreme heat, limited water, and an enemy, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, which was mobile, well-trained, and commanded by a tactical genius. British forces were struggling to contain Rommel, who seemed to outmaneuver every conventional British strategy. David began studying the situation. He realized that conventional military tactics were ineffective in the desert. Large formations were easy to detect and could be outmaneuvered by mobile German forces. But small units, operating behind enemy lines, could strike at targets that large formations couldn't reach. Supply dumps, airfields, headquarters. The desert's vast emptiness, which made conventional operations difficult, actually favored small, covert teams. In July 1941, David decided to parachute behind enemy lines on a reconnaissance mission. Parachute operations were new and dangerous, but David believed the risk was acceptable. The jump went catastrophically wrong. Strong winds blew David off course. He landed hard, injuring his back and legs. He was temporarily paralyzed, unable to move, lying in the desert with potentially fatal injuries. David's companions eventually found him and carried him to safety. He was evacuated to a hospital in Cairo, where doctors told him he had severely damaged his spine. He might never walk again. He would certainly never be a combat soldier. David Stirling's military career appeared to be over before it truly began. But lying in that hospital bed, unable to move, David Stirling conceived an idea that would change military history. He began writing a proposal for a new type of military unit. Small teams, initially just 5 men, would be inserted deep behind enemy lines. They would target high-value assets, aircraft on airfields, fuel dumps, ammunition depots, headquarters. They would strike at night, cause maximum damage, and disappear before the enemy could respond. It would be warfare conducted by ghosts, appearing suddenly to destroy and then vanishing into the desert. The concept was revolutionary. Military doctrine emphasized large formations, firepower, and holding territory. David's proposal reversed everything: small teams, stealth over firepower, mobility over holding ground. Most military commanders would have dismissed it as fantasy, but David believed it would work, and he was determined to prove it. Still recovering from his injuries, barely able to walk, David Stirling sneaked out of the hospital and into British Middle East headquarters in Cairo. He couldn't get an appointment through official channels. He was a junior officer with a crazy idea. So he literally broke into headquarters, hobbling on crutches, sneaking past sentries until he found a senior officer who would listen. That officer was General Neil Ritchie, Deputy Chief of Staff. Ritchie was impressed by David's audacity. Sneaking into headquarters on crutches showed exactly the kind of initiative the British Army needed. He read David's proposal and recognized its potential. Within days, David had approval to form a new unit, L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name was deliberately deceptive. There was no Special Air Service Brigade. It was a fiction designed to make the Germans think Britain had a large parachute force in North Africa. L Detachment was actually just David and permission to recruit 60 men. From this tiny beginning, the modern Special Air Service, the SAS, one of the world's most elite special operations forces, would be born. David Stirling began recruiting. He didn't want conventional soldiers. He wanted men who were tough, resourceful, and capable of independent thinking. He recruited from commando units, finding soldiers who had been in trouble for being too aggressive or too independent. He wanted rule breakers, men who would improvise and adapt rather than follow doctrine blindly. His unconventional skills didn't fit mold, but they were ideal traits for the birth of a type of warfare that David Stirling was inventing.
The first SAS operation was a disaster. In November 1941, 5 teams parachuted behind German lines during a massive storm. The wind scattered the parachutists, equipment was lost, and most teams were captured or killed. Only 22 of the 60 men who jumped returned. It was a catastrophic failure that should have ended the SAS before it truly began. But David Stirling learned from failure. Parachuting in the desert was too unreliable. Instead, he partnered with the Long Range Desert Group, a unit specializing in desert navigation. The LRDG would drive SAS teams deep into enemy territory in specially modified trucks. The SAS would conduct raids, then the LRDG would extract them. This partnership proved devastatingly effective. On December 14, 1941, David Stirling led his first successful raid against Sirte Airfield in Libya. His team infiltrated the airfield at night, placed explosive charges on German aircraft, and withdrew. When the charges detonated, 24 aircraft were destroyed in seconds. It was one of the most successful small-unit actions of the war, and it proved David's concept worked. More raids followed. Ajdabiya Airfield, 37 aircraft destroyed. Benghazi Airfield, 30 aircraft and fuel dumps destroyed. Sidi Hanish, 18 aircraft destroyed. The SAS struck repeatedly, appearing suddenly at distant airfields the Germans thought were safe, destroying aircraft and disappearing before reinforcements arrived. Rommel's Afrika Korps was being bled by an enemy they couldn't catch or stop. David Stirling's tactics were simple, but devastatingly effective. Small teams, usually 5 to 10 men, would approach targets at night. They used a new type of bomb called the Lewis bomb, invented by Jacques Lewis, which was light enough to carry in quantity, but powerful enough to destroy aircraft. Teams would place bombs on parked aircraft, set timers, and withdraw. By the time the explosion started, the SAS was miles away. The psychological impact on the Germans was enormous. Airfields that should have been safe, far behind the front lines, guarded by security forces, were being attacked regularly. German pilots became afraid to leave aircraft parked overnight. Resources had to be diverted to airfield security, reducing combat effectiveness. Rommel himself reportedly called the SAS a thorn in my side, the highest compliment an enemy commander could give. By mid-1942, the SAS had destroyed more than 250 Axis aircraft on the ground. More than the entire Royal Air Force had destroyed in air combat in North Africa during the same period. David Stirling's tiny unit, never numbering more than about 100 men, had accomplished more than entire squadrons of fighter planes. It was an astonishing vindication of his unconventional tactics. David Stirling was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given expanded authority. The SAS grew, adding new squadrons and taking on more ambitious operations. David personally led many raids, refusing to command from safety while his men took risks. He believed that officers should lead from the front, sharing dangers with their soldiers. This leadership style earned absolute loyalty from his men. But David's success made him a target. German intelligence identified him as the commander of the unit causing so much damage. Rommel issued standing orders. If David Stirling was captured, he was to be executed immediately as a terrorist, not treated as a prisoner of war. Hitler himself issued the Commando Order in 1942, mandating that all captured commando and special operations soldiers be killed, not taken prisoner. David Stirling's luck finally ran out in January 1943. He was leading a deep reconnaissance mission into Tunisia when his patrol was surprised by German forces. A fierce firefight erupted. David tried to escape but was surrounded and forced to surrender. He had been captured by the very enemy that had orders to execute him immediately. Remarkably, the German officers who captured David didn't execute him. Despite Hitler's commando order, these professional soldiers couldn't bring themselves to murder a prisoner of war. They respected David as a fellow officer and warrior. He was sent to a POW camp in Italy, where he immediately began planning escapes. David Stirling escaped 4 times from various POW camps. Each time he was recaptured, but his persistence was legendary among prisoners and guards alike. The Germans finally sent him to Colditz Castle, a maximum security camp for prisoners considered especially dangerous or likely to escape. David spent the rest of the war there, unable to continue his campaign against the Germans. The SAS continued without him, fighting in Italy, France, and eventually Germany. David's brother Bill Stirling commanded SAS operations in Europe. The organization David had created from nothing, initially just him and 60 men, had grown into multiple regiments conducting operations across multiple theaters. David's concept of small unit special operations had been proven spectacularly successful. When the war ended in 1945, David Stirling was liberated from Colditz. He returned to Britain as a hero, decorated for his service and recognized as one of the war's most innovative military leaders. The SAS was disbanded after the war, as Britain demobilized its military. It seemed that David Stirling's creation had been temporary, relevant only for wartime. But David Stirling understood that special operations forces would be essential in future conflicts. He spent the post-war years advocating for the permanent establishment of the SAS. In 1950, when Britain became involved in counterinsurgency operations in Malaya, the SAS was reformed. David's vision of small, elite units conducting unconventional warfare had become permanent doctrine. David Stirling never returned to active military service, but he remained involved in military and intelligence matters. He founded various private security and military training companies, some of which operated in African countries during the Cold War. His work in this area was controversial. Some saw him as helping developing nations, others as a mercenary enabling conflicts. David himself saw it as continuing his lifelong commitment to unconventional warfare. In his later years, David Stirling was recognized as the father of modern special operations warfare. The SAS became one of the world's most respected special forces units, conducting operations in conflicts from the Falkland War to Iraq and Afghanistan. Every modern special operations unit, from American Delta Force to Israeli Sayeret Matkal, owes something to the tactics and organizational principles David Stirling pioneered in the North African desert. David Stirling was knighted in 1990, becoming Sir David Stirling in recognition of his contributions to British military history. He was 75 years old, and his health was failing, but he attended the ceremony with pride. The aristocrat who had dropped out of Cambridge and seemed destined for a life of aimless privilege had instead created one of the most important military innovations of the 20th century. David Stirling died on November 4, 1990, at the age of 74. He was buried with full military honors. Members of the SAS attended his funeral, paying respects to the man who had founded their regiment and established the traditions they still follow. His legacy lives on every time SAS soldiers conduct operations using the tactics and principles David developed 8 decades ago. The moment that defines David Stirling's legacy came in an interview late in his life. A journalist asked him what he was most proud of accomplishing. David thought for a long moment, then gave an answer that captured his entire philosophy. He said he was proud that he had proven that small groups of determined individuals could accomplish what large organizations often couldn't. The SAS succeeded not because of overwhelming firepower or numerical superiority, but because of initiative, daring, and refusal to accept conventional limitations. That principle, that a few good men with the right plan could change the course of battles, was his greatest contribution to military thinking. That was David Stirling, an aristocrat who became a warrior, a rebel who created one of the most disciplined military units in history, a man who proved that unconventional thinking, applied with courage and skill, could defeat enemies that seemed unbeatable through conventional means.